Skaggs, who says that she is Cynthia Davis's doppelganger. But that is truly on the screen there, Emily Skaggs, who has just recently joined the Sustain SC team as the Director of Events and Marketing. And she will be our webinar technician today. We do have our entire team here with us today on this webinar. I want to acknowledge Leslie Scarden, Sustain SC CEO, and Cynthia Davis, Sustain SC's Vice President. And they are listening in. And we are so excited, though, to be a full team of 4. Sustain SC is about to celebrate our 4th anniversary as an organization in early March. And we have grown to a staff of 4 with capacity. And as we kick off 2025, it's already showing impacts the organization is having with this added capacity. So we're so excited for you to join us today, and we look forward to you joining us for a series of events and efforts to make South Carolina more sustainable in 2025. For those who are joining today who may be new to Sustain SC, we are a nonpartisan, economic development, commerce-driven, and conservation-minded, not-for-profit organization. And our mission is to connect sustainability goals of business in South Carolina with local solutions for the benefit of our economy, our environment, and our people. And there is no better time in the Palmetto State to be focused on this critical mission. Word is out that South Carolina is a great place to do business and to live. In 2024, the U.S. Census identified South Carolina as the fastest growing population in the United States. So just to put it in context, just last year, South Carolina received 90,000 new citizens. That is more than the entire population of the city of Greenville, where I live. So with growth comes energy demand. So there is no better time to talk energy in South Carolina than today. So as we think about today's conversation, energy is one of the 7 accelerators that Sustain SC is focused on. Our membership and our stakeholders have identified that to become a more sustainable South Carolina, there are really these 7 different accelerators in which Sustain SC needs to focus to support our state. And today we will be focused on affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy. And throughout the year, we're going to have continued conversations and efforts on the other 6 accelerators. I do want to acknowledge that the accelerator of partnerships is literally the heartbeat of our organization. And so we cannot do it without all of you who are on the call today, really focused and working with us hand in hand in these efforts. So as we said, today's focus is energy. And for all our accelerators, we have priorities identified and strategic actions in which we're working. For affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy, we are focused on priorities on identifying company demand by meeting emission goals that are within sustainability plans and efforts. And we really are working to foster solutions for affordable, reliable, and clean energy. And so that really turns into these strategic actions. And today is the focus on one of our big actions that we've been working with RMI on to put together an energy study for South Carolina that you're here to hear about. And then we hope that you will join us in the coming year for 4 different roundtables across the state to have a more robust conversation around 4 different themes that have come out of the RMI study that we'll hear. So, for our agenda today, this is hopefully the most you're going to hear me talk. And I will now turn it over to Lachlan Carey, who will be joining us from RMI. I do want to note that our guests will be muted so we can focus in on the presentation. So if as you have questions as you're listening to the presentation, please put your questions in the chat. And once Lachlan is finished with his presentation, we will take about 10 minutes to go through Q&A with the group. But I do want to now introduce you to Lachlan. Lachlan Carey is a manager for RMI with the U.S. Programs. And he's leading the work on regional economic development through clean energy investments. And thank you so much, Lachlan, for joining us. We are thrilled to hear about the results of the RMI study for South Carolina. And before I turn it over to you, we do want to note that this conversation is being recorded, so it can be made available afterwards to those who could not join us today, or if you'd like to hear it again if you need some information. All right, so with that being said, I will turn it over to you, Lachlan.
Right. Thank you so much, Kristen. So, as you mentioned, RMI has been doing some work with Sustain SC for the last few months, thinking about, what does a clean energy-led economic development strategy look like? And what we mean by that is, how can you leverage the ongoing clean energy transition to sort of maximize the goals of economic development, to create jobs, to create opportunities, to attract investment to the state of South Carolina? And this is obviously an area where South Carolina really leads in a whole range of sectors. And so why shouldn't that range of sectors include clean energy? And so today what I wanted to do was give a slightly condensed and updated version of that longer report, which is available on RMI's website. And you can just sort of Google toward a clean energy-led economic development strategy for South Carolina. And so this will be slightly abridged with a few updates. Those updates are around some of the trends we're seeing in the energy transition space, and also trends that we're seeing from federal government right now, which is obviously sort of putting this space in a bit of limbo and policy uncertainty. And wanted to give you just a few updates of sort of where we're seeing the lay of the land there. So without further ado, I think the place to start is simply with the fact that clean energy investment in the United States, it was rising, it was growing before the IRA or the Inflation Reduction Act passed in August 2022, and it's going to continue accelerating, right? So I know that there's a lot of uncertainty in the field right now, like what does this all mean? Where are things going? But we truly believe that the economics is on the side of clean energy technologies, and this isn't, some sort of ESG pie in the sky, wishy-washy hope from a couple of sort of speculative corporate goals. It is sort of where technology trends are heading, where investment flows are heading. And if you look at this chart, you can see pretty clearly, the extraordinary growth from around 10 billion a quarter in 2018 to over 70 billion dollars a quarter in clean energy investment as of Q3 2024. And so the Inflation Reduction Act was certainly an accelerant on these trends, but it was by no means the be all and end all. So, and this isn't just restricted to the United States. So if we look at clean tech supply chain investment, so in the manufacturing side, in the factories, our left-hand side chart here shows global manufacturing, over $140 billion in 2024, and that's not the complete 2024 numbers, globally in clean tech manufacturing. In the United States, it's now well over $40 billion. You can see again that exponential growth trajectory. And in South Carolina, we saw over $2.5 billion of investment in clean tech manufacturing in 2024. And so we see similar patterns of growth across the global, national, and indeed state level sort of jurisdictions here. Now, we believe that the reason for this is that technologies fundamentally beat commodities on costs. So what does that mean? It we've traditionally sort of thought of energy markets as being a commodity, right? You dig up coal or extract oil and gas. These are commodities that get traded on global markets and are sort of subject to the whims of those markets. And so we're all used to the kind of price sort of volatility that accompanies commodity markets, right? There's no reason to believe necessarily that oil prices will be cheaper next year than they were this year because of the nature of that commodity market. Clean energy technologies are different because of that final word. They are technologies, and technologies get cheaper the more we do them. So we can not just expect, we can almost guarantee that solar, the wind, the batteries will be cheaper next year than they were today. And that's because they're technologies that are subject to the rules of technologies, the rules of economies of scale, of learning by doing. And if we look at those cost curves over extended timeframes, you see that play out, right? Oil, costs as much, if not more, than it did in 1900. Natural gas costs a little bit less, but pretty similar to what it did in 1980. Whereas if you look at those same cost trajectories for solar, for wind, for batteries, it's remarkable how quickly those cost curves are falling, and we expect those trends to continue. And it's not just costs. Technologies have been beating out commodities on speed. So if you look at the rate of uptake of solar energy, it took 8 years to go from, sorry, 10 years. I'm getting confused by my own chart here, but the point is simply that solar has increased its amount of terawatt hours, so the amount of energy that we consume from solar producing assets has got to 10 terawatt hours, far faster than any other energy source in history. Faster than nuclear in the 70s, certainly than coal or than gas. And so what we're seeing is simply unprecedented uptake of these technologies, and it's really sort of almost hard to remember at this point that solar really is only kind of 8 to 12 years old as a sort of scalable economic solution. And so we're still in the early days, and yet we have seen the amount of uptake of solar just sort of at a historic and remarkable pace. And so when we turn our gaze to South Carolina in particular, what we see is that South Carolina is really punching above its weight on the clean tech manufacturing side. And that's where we really see the key economic development spillovers or benefits arising. There's a few reasons for that, right? Manufacturing jobs tend to be higher paid, they tend to be higher quality jobs. Manufacturing firms tend to invest more in research and development, and that has all sorts of technological spillovers. And manufactured goods are more able to be exported than producing solar electricity, for example. It's much more difficult to export that overseas, and so bringing in those export dollars to communities, has those sort of multiplier economic development effects. And if you look around the country, you see this sort of what we're calling the battery belt. That area from Michigan down to Georgia or even Alabama, of much higher clean tech manufacturing activity than the rest of the country, and South Carolina is very much included in that belt. But we can get even more granular and look at project announcements and those that are under construction. And what you see is this interesting trend of a sort of particular concentration of clean tech manufacturing announcements along the I-85. And so what I did here is I filtered all the clean tech manufacturing projects announced nationally to just those that have been announced in a county through which the I-85 runs. And what you see is this this pretty remarkable sort of clustering along this key piece of infrastructure. And so one of our sort of core recommendations within the report is thinking about, well, what could an I-85 clean tech corridor look like, right? So taking many of the examples that we've seen in let's say the North Carolina's Research Triangle, and using those cluster strategies to really kind of 1+1 = 3 when you work together, use shared infrastructure, use shared resources, coordinate on investment attraction strategies, on reaching out to potential investors overseas, in setting up shared site selection, facilities and services. There's a range of ways in which the states and EDOs along the I-85 could sort of work together to really turn this into a sort of world-class clean tech corridor. And what we've seen in examples of global leaders such as China is that their clean tech manufacturing capacity really does come through these clustering strategies. So having supply chain components up and downstream, working alongside and near each other, sharing R&D facilities, reducing transportation costs by locating along key pieces of infrastructure. There are all sorts of ways in which clusters really kind of boost those potential economic development outcomes. And so that's, I think, a really powerful potential strategy for South Carolina to leverage going forward. But we are in this moment of uncertainty, as I mentioned up top. So if we look at these projects, many of them have only been announced. Many of them are under construction. So if you look at the whole of the United States, at all the clean tech projects that we've seen, you can see that over half are just in the announced phase, right? And many of you who are in the economic development world will know that an announced project is very, very far from being, real dollars in the community. And so, in South Carolina in particular, we see less of the share being just announced, but a really high share being under construction. So over $10 billion worth of projects are currently under construction in South Carolina. And even then, there's no guarantee that we are at the point where those will be operating, where they will be employing new workers, where they will be investing in local communities. And so those investments are at risk. They are sort of subject to the whims of the market and the whims of politics, quite frankly. And so that's certainly something to look out for. The other sort of key kind of trend that we're seeing right now is just extraordinary what we call load growth. So demand for electricity, across the country, and there's a couple of key reasons for that. So a group called Rhodium Group ran some excellent analysis on this, looking at the sources of demand growth going out to 2035. And so most of these are kind of what you would expect. Industrial, we've sort of talked about that, a lot of new manufacturing facilities, a lot of growth in various industries that are going to demand more from the electricity grid. Buildings, obviously, as population increases, Kristen mentioned this up top, where more people running more appliances, we're going to get greater electricity demand. Data centers are the really big sort of shift, and I'm sure you've all sort of been following the news on this, that the sort of AI revolution is just creating this extraordinary demand for data centers, which are extremely energy intensive. And because of that, we're seeing nearly over a fifth of electricity demand growth out to 2035 coming from data centers alone, which is really sort of changing the game in terms of how much electricity and how much clean electricity we need to get on the grid in a relatively short period of time. And then almost half of the electricity demand growth is expected to come from transport, which in other words is electric vehicles, right? The more people drive electric vehicles, the more they're going to demand electricity instead of oil for the energy in their transportation. Now, these factors are particularly pronounced in South Carolina, which again, as mentioned, is experiencing quite an extraordinary economic and population and energy boom. It's the third fastest growing economy in the region, has the second fastest population growth, and the third fastest growth in overall energy consumption within the region. And so you can see here from these charts how it compares across these regions, the whole region. And it's pretty remarkable. And so this is going to put strains on its infrastructure, on its electric grid. And on the one hand, you can view that as a risk, as a constraint, but it's also quite clearly an opportunity for folks who are in industries that are supplying this growth. So for South Carolina in particular, we can actually break down these demand drivers across different the different grids that exist within the US. And so if we look particularly at Duke, we're seeing data centers and manufacturing, as you might expect, being the key drivers of demand. Electrification, which, as I mentioned, with particularly important on the transportation and buildings front, is less of a demand driver in South Carolina right now, but this may change. So just to focus a little bit on industrial energy use, I think it's important, within this context of meeting load growth, of meeting higher electricity demand, that it's going to be very important for South Carolina to retain its sort of competitive advantage as having particularly low energy costs. And so if you look at the amount that different states spend of their economic output on energy, you can see here on the left-hand chart that South Carolina has a much higher share than other states. So energy is particularly important to South Carolina's economy, and that's driven particularly by commercial and industrial energy uses, as you might expect. The right-hand chart here shows you how South Carolina has consistently maintained some of the lowest electricity prices for industrial users in the region. And so as we talk about the expansion of clean energy and the expansion of energy writ large, we need to maintain this as a sort of fundamental constraint on what we do, because it's such a sort of core element of South Carolina's economy. But the good news here is that solar and storage, as I sort of mentioned, in the macro framing up top, can really meet this new demand the fastest. If we look at the average amount of time it takes to develop a power plant in the United States, we can start at the bottom here. It takes nearly 16 years to go from concept to operation of a nuclear plant. Many of you will have seen this in neighboring state of Georgia and various attempts in South Carolina's own history as well. Coal, a little over 6 years, not quite as bad as nuclear, but still takes an awfully long time. Natural gas, it's much shorter. But when we get to wind, and then particularly to batteries and solar, we can just build this stuff so much faster. And I think this is really underrated, that the flexibility of being able to build quickly, build in a modular fashion in smaller amounts over a much broader area. I think that flexibility is a sort of key piece of why clean energy can meet this electricity demand in such an effective fashion. And so I think that's worth keeping in the back of your mind. If we look at South Carolina in particular, South Carolina has quadrupled its renewable electricity capacity since 2018. The chart on the left here shows you sort of comparing across the region, sort of standardizing all of those numbers to the 2018 figure. You can see that Virginia, Delaware, and Florida have increased renewable electricity much faster than South Carolina. But on the other hand, South Carolina is well ahead of its immediate northern neighbor, North Carolina, but also West Virginia, Maryland, and about neck and neck with Georgia. Importantly, over 70% of planned electricity capacity additions in the state are solar energy. So what the right-hand chart shows you here is all the different projects that are sort of in the interconnection queue that are sort of being proposed, but are yet to be built or in operation. The vast majority of those are solar. The next highest share is clearly batteries, and then there's some natural gas as well. And so I think, this isn't just a reminder, this isn't theoretical, this is happening, and it's happening much faster in these technologies than anywhere else. RMI has an open source energy systems model that we use to think, about what this could look like into the future, out to 2050. And so in a sort of business as usual scenario on the left-hand side, you can see utility scale solar continues to increase very quickly. Wind basically flattens out. Natural gas starts to come back, and nuclear we've just held constant across that time frame. However, in what we call the climate aligned scenario, so if we were to switch to clean energy at a pace consistent with sort of globally agreed climate goals, then you can see utility scale solar, wind just take off at sort of unprecedented levels. And so, that's sort of this is kind of, I think, of the range of options that we see ahead of us. So guaranteed growth in solar, and then really a much more uncertain outlook for wind and natural gas, and certainly just the sheer pace of solar growth as well. So I wanted to talk briefly about the federal state of play. What are we seeing at the federal level, and how might this sort of affect what's going on the ground? So again, Inflation Reduction Act was this sort of critical piece of legislation passed back in 2022 that's just been this accelerant on all things clean energy. And the new administration has come in and labeled a lot of that spending as the Green New Deal, and is trying to sort of claw that back and gum up the works. And so, we're still kind of awaiting exactly what that looks like, but I can give you some initial thoughts. So grant funding that's already been spent is safe. This is almost impossible to claw back, and so if you've received a grant, we expect that grant to be safe. Grants that are obligated but are unspent. So there's ongoing litigation in this space, which I'm certainly not going to try and predict. The funds are legally committed, but there's just going to be a lot more attention paid to the award terms and sort of how sort of closely those are abided by. Unobligated, unspent grants, this administration is certainly trying to claw back. We estimate that less than 10% of total Inflation Reduction Act funding is in this category. The Loan Programs Office, which, as far as I'm aware, hasn't made any loans in South Carolina, but certainly could, is a bit more uncertain. Its immediate outlook. So certainly under the previous Trump administration, LPO activity ground virtually to a halt. But we could also imagine, there's a lot of priorities of the new DOE secretary, for example, around geothermal, around advanced nuclear, where LPO could play a really significant role. And so, there's different scenarios that could happen there. And then in terms of the tax credits, all the tax credits are at risk, but this really depends on the credit itself, and how, particularly what sort of benefits have been seen in communities that will be voting on a potential reconciliation package over the next 6 months. So to quickly kind of run through our assessment of how at risk these different tax credits are. Of minimal concern, we see things like the industrial tax credits around hydrogen, carbon capture, sustainable aviation fuels. We expect those to survive the reconciliation process. The manufacturing production tax credit, which I think is particularly important for a lot of investment activity in South Carolina, is less vulnerable, but certainly still, in those active discussions. Slightly more vulnerable are the broader renewable energy tax credits. Again, this is extremely important in South Carolina, where, as I've said, we've seen this extraordinary growth in renewable electricity investment. Also, the buildings tax credits. The most vulnerable, pretty clearly, around offshore wind, where we've already seen the Trump administration sort of put a pause on all offshore and indeed onshore wind leases on federal lands, but of course that's more important for offshore. And the EV tax credits, so the consumer side tax credits, are certainly something that we feel is highly at risk. The manufacturing tax credits, we're in an interesting moment around those, where there's certainly the repeal risk is causing enough uncertainty in the sort of investment outlook that we've seen companies sort of pull back from some of those investments. And so that's a real concern, particularly, as I say, in South Carolina, where so much of those investments are still in a kind of yet to be operating phase. But on the other hand, we're also seeing some potential bipartisan support emerge for expanding these tax credits, right? The incoming Trump administration is certainly, in favor of expanding American manufacturing, expanding American exports, and so the manufacturing production tax credit is certainly a powerful way of doing that. We've also seen a series of tariffs implemented and threatened by the new administration, particularly the threats on Canada and Mexico. It's implemented the across the board 10% tariff on Chinese imports and is about to implement a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum. The right-hand chart shows you the varying percentages that Canada, China, and Mexico sort of form in different energy-related imports. So, by far the biggest effect would be a lot on oil and gas, where Canada, exports a lot to the US. Lithium storage batteries are a huge source of imports from China, and so we'd expect that to pass through to the cost of electric vehicles and a whole range of other manufactured goods that include lithium storage. And then the tariff on steel aluminum, this is of course an input into a range of technologies, both clean and otherwise. So we expect this to, have uh, an upward pressure on the costs of things like transmission lines, various clean energy technology components. There's just a whole wide range of manufactured goods that are part of this clean energy transition that of course use steel and or aluminum as part of their production process. Um, and so to kind of zoom in on South Carolina in particular and sort of what's at risk, I mean, South Carolina has already received nearly $1 billion in federal clean energy investments. We expect that in a high demand scenario that this could be worth 10 to $14 billion by 2031 across clean electricity, manufacturing, and vehicle tax credits. And so, these are the sorts of federal dollars that may or may not continue flowing to South Carolina, depending on what happens in this congressional term. So, in this context, what can South Carolina do is essentially the question. And we continue to sort of believe in what we call our 3Cs framework. So competitiveness, constraints, and coordination. Where is South Carolina competitive? How can it leverage that competitiveness? What are the constraints, and how can it address those in a targeted fashion? And then who needs to be at the table? Who needs to work together to sort of overcome those constraints and to maximize South Carolina's competitiveness? And these are the questions that everyone needs to continue asking of themselves, to really make the most of this economic development opportunity. So on the competitiveness front, I mean, I really continue to believe that this is a once in a generation opportunity. It's just a step phase change in the technological outlook, as I sort of mentioned right up top, regardless of policy support, regardless of sort of corporate sustainability goals. These are real technology changes that are fundamentally transforming our energy system and transforming the manufacturing sector writ large in this country. South Carolina, of course, has a bunch of existing related industries, related economic capabilities that it can leverage in sort of pursuing that once in a generation opportunity. But what that really takes is industry by industry, strategic plans. And this is something that most states don't do particularly well, is sort of identify an industry where it makes sense, look in depth at that industry. What are the constraints? Where can existing industrial skills and workforce be leveraged? And what are the policy levers here that can really put South Carolina at a competitive advantage? And so what we've done is conduct some analysis on South Carolina around those economic feasibilities. So, what industries are driving competitiveness in South Carolina, and therefore, what are the clean energy industries that it makes the most sense for South Carolina to transition into? And so what you see here on the left in this 2x2 is identifying on the x-axis that feasibility score. So how much a clean energy industry sort of interacting with or leveraging the skills and capabilities of existing economic capacities across the state. And then the y-axis is complexity. And this is a measure of how much a particular industry sort of touches on the broader economy and how much a place can specialize in that industry, and therefore how much can that be a driver or an anchor of economic development in the region. Um, and so what we see, as we might expect, manufacture of durable goods in the energy transition, I think are going to be sort of key sources of competitiveness for South Carolina. Manufacture of energy efficient appliances, of electric vehicles, of batteries and components, HVAC systems, indeed manufacture of energy utility systems, so transmission infrastructure and transformers, that sort of thing. These are areas where South Carolina already has those underlying capabilities, and therefore it's a much easier jump into these clean energy industries where it can leverage its existing workforce, it can leverage its existing infrastructure in a way that sort of increases the chances of highly positive economic development outcomes. It's also important to note that these feasibilities vary across the state. I certainly don't need to tell anyone in this call that not every region in South Carolina is the same, and so different regions already specialize in different industries, and therefore that those capabilities will translate into different pieces of the clean energy economy. And so what I've done here is broke out those potential competitive industries across South Carolina's major regions. Um, our second C is constraint, and so clearly there remain a range of potential constraints or investment barriers that policymakers, groups like this, NGOs, private sector can all help address and need to be thinking about. And obviously, the sort of foremost of those is, as mentioned up top, just South Carolina's booming economy and population. This creates all sorts of challenges on infrastructure, on housing, on having the right skills, the right workers in the right industries. These are real challenges, and they take genuine sort of consideration and investment in state capacity to address. And I'm not going to go through all these, but I think they're all worth considering and all worth having a sort of plan of attack, as it were. And then finally, thinking a little bit about coordination, what are those key sort of recommendations or policies going forward? Obviously, continuing to coordinate with the federal government, particularly in this environment of uncertainty. If these tax credits are important to economic development outcomes in your area, then it's worth not just coordinating, but making that known to congresspersons, senators, indeed the administration itself, that there are key pieces of legislation, key tax credits that aren't just sort of the Green New Deal, as it were, but are driving economic development outcomes in the region. Interagency coordination efforts, we've seen efforts such as Power SC in South Carolina can be powerful mechanisms of economic change. And then public-private coordination, as I've mentioned, for example, the Clean Tech I-85 corridor, a public-private effort to coordinate actors along that corridor, could be a really powerful driver of investment attraction and job growth. I've tried to bucket all of that into an infographic that sort of captures those potential options. There's sort of 4 buckets here that we see, as part of an economic development strategy. The sort of strategic coordination piece, just prioritizing key industries, having industry roadmaps, developing cluster strategies, particularly in South Carolina around solar, around EVs, and around green hydrogen. Demand pull measures, things like buy clean policies, clean standards, low carbon fuel standards. These are all ways of boosting local demand for these emerging technologies. Of course, what we call supply push incentives. So how do you reduce the costs of these investments? South Carolina obviously has its governor's closing fund. That's a powerful form of investment attraction by reducing those investment costs. It also has its job development credit and the economic development set aside. So these are all tools that can be used, leveraged, expanded, scaled to promote clean energy led industrial and economic development in the state. And then, it's worth thinking about within each of these sectors, there are these kind of cross-cutting inputs that are really critical to driving economic activity as well. So things like entrepreneurship and innovation, workforce development, just having enough cheap and abundant clean electricity is, of course, super important here. Having the right kinds of capital availability. So a lot of these are emerging or novel technologies. How do we sort of support the venture side, the early stage capital that's needed to make those investments happen in South Carolina first before they happen elsewhere? And then the land piece, obviously, particularly large manufacturing projects, large energy projects are going to need a lot of land, suitable land, have the right infrastructure hookups, and so on. There's a lot of proactive work that can be done to make sure that South Carolina is really set up to take advantage of those opportunities in the way it treats and plans and thinks about its land. So I know that's an awful lot of information in a relatively short period of time. As I say, the broader strategy is available on our website, and hopefully I've left enough time here for some questions. So please feel free to ask questions, whether it's directly related to the presentation or otherwise. And then you have my email here if you'd prefer to get in touch offline. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lachlan. You really laid it out on the complexities of this issue and given us a lot of food for thought. Um, we have our participants muted, so if anyone has a question, please go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'll monitor the questions that you may have for Lachlan. And so if there are any questions and as they come through, I'll take just a couple of minutes if questions are being formed. Just to note that, Lachlan, you did just an excellent job giving the full picture of the state of energy within South Carolina and the complexities that we're facing as we find ourselves as such a growing state. And the study that you all conducted basically has been the foundation for a series of roundtable discussions that Sustain SC will be hosting in 2025 in this coming year. Our first one will be on February 20th in Columbia. And we are basically hosting a quarterly roundtable around the state to address key themes that really came out of the study. Our first one on February 20th will be a level set where we will be addressing energy consumption and really getting a baseline understanding of what we're looking at when it comes to residential, commercial, and industrial efficiency opportunities as we are consuming our energies in the state. The second roundtable will be on May 6th in the Greenville area, and it'll focus on energy production and looking at clean energy opportunities in South Carolina. We're going to go back to Columbia for session 3 and look at the grid modernization and how what the clean energy future will look like as we modernize our grid. And then we'll wrap up the session in December in the Charleston region to really look at how can we strengthen clean energy efforts in rural parts of South Carolina. So want to put that out there that more information will be on our website under events for you to stay tuned for those roundtable discussions that will be available to our membership. So while I have been making the commercial break for our upcoming roundtable series, a couple of questions have come in. One, could you elaborate a bit on the method tool used to indicate ideal growth industries for metro regions?
Yeah, and thank you, Jory, for the question. So this comes from data we pulled together for what we call our clean growth tool. I've sent the link in the chat. And so this uses a methodology that came out of the Harvard economic complexity sort of program over there. And so what it does is essentially take industry location data to build a whole network map of the US economy. And then what it is trying to measure is the implicit economic capabilities based on how often these different industries co-locate with one another. So let's say industries A, B, and C are typically found together around the economy. It probably means that they share a similar workforce, similar knowledge, similar infrastructure, etc. And so South Carolina would only have industries A and B. That would suggest that it has the economic capabilities to move into industry C. And so instead of trying to measure every single capability, so your workforce skills, your infrastructure quality, you on and on and on, and then try and predict how that kind of maps onto an industry. This does it implicitly through that co-location data, and has been found to be a powerful sort of tool for directing strategic economic prioritization. It's not the only tool, obviously. We try and put this against lots of other data we have around these industries, but I think it is a powerful measure. Keisha or Kesha, on your question about exports for battery manufacturing. So the US is actually the largest importer of lithium-ion batteries, and so to that extent, getting into the battery market in the US is there is a powerful domestic market to serve, and currently most of those lithium-ion batteries are coming from China, which perhaps unsurprisingly is the world's largest exporter. Taken as a whole, though, Europe is the largest import market, where we see really strong EV sales. Countries like Norway are sort of up to kind of 90% EV penetration, and so I think Europe is probably the largest potential export market for US-made lithium-ion batteries. I would suggest we're a decent way away from batteries being a major export, simply because there's such a big domestic market to serve, and Chinese imports to sort of substitute for, first of all. So slide 12, industrial energy costs. Hmm. Um, So it's a really good question. I didn't look into residential energy costs for South Carolina, so that is certainly something that I can look at separately and get a sense of for you. I'm just going back to slide 12 here, and so there's just a lot of different factors that drive electricity costs. Obviously, just the sheer amount of demand relative to supply. So, as we mentioned a few times, just a booming population in Carolina is going to put more and more sort of stress on existing supply, and we've seen Duke and Dominion really in their resource plans kind of trying to get out ahead of this and say, like, we've got to build a lot more electricity capacity than we have in the past to meet this booming population, and so that will put downward pressure on prices. There's also a range of considerations just around the reliability of electricity supply and the different technologies in extreme weather events. So I think there's a bit of a misconception out there that solar and wind are less reliable than natural gas, for example. But we've seen in things like the deep freeze in Texas a couple of years ago, and South Carolina had a similar incident with the hurricane, where the natural gas facilities were actually some of the least reliable in terms of providing electricity in those extreme weather events, and that of course causes price spikes as well. And so we found that the flexibility of having so much distributed energy resources in solar and batteries all over the state and beyond, that really helps maintain stability of prices as well. And so certainly as we add more batteries to the grid and renewable electricity is able to provide electricity even when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing, we would expect the stability of those prices and the continued downward trajectory of those prices. Hope that answers your question. Any others?
All right. Well, it looks like if anybody has any more questions, feel welcome to put it in the chat in the next few seconds. And then we will be wrapping up here. I think today is so critical to be having this conversation, and it really is the foundation and the launch point to our roundtable series that we're hosting in 2025. But we do hope that you can join us on our first session on February 20th. And as a follow-up to today's conversation, there's a question here for you, Lachlan, whether RMI can make figure data files available as part of the report.
Yeah, it's a great question. They should be. That is very easily done, and so here is the report online. But all of these charts are available online, and therefore can be the data can be downloaded. I'll find a good way to share those on the website. So if you go to the website, then you should be able to find those charts and download the relevant data.
Fantastic. So we will be following up on our website. We'll have a link to today's recording. We will also follow up with you all with the slides, as well as a link to RMI's website where you can find the study and further information. And unless there are no other questions, we will go ahead and wrap up. And let's see, it looks like one more question. Will Sustain SC be sharing the report broadly beyond Sustain SC members? Well, this report, Lachlan, is on your website, correct? So this will be public information if you go to the RMI website. Did we lose Lachlan?
Kristen, just to chime in here, yes, this report is publicly available on RMI's website. Sustain SC also shared it out around Symposium, and we'll also be sharing the slides and a link to this presentation.
Thank you, Leslie. It looks like we lost Lachlan. I think he had a technical difficulty there. Perfect. So stay tuned for all that information on our website. And please join us for more upcoming events. We have another technical assistance webinar coming up on March 18th, where we're going to be focused in on the forest carbon programs and doing a level set of Forest Carbon 101. We have the Sustainability Summit Driving the Sustainable Future event in Greenville that is happening with BMW, Furman, and other partners. And then you can see the other events coming up in April. And then you can always find more information about our events on our website by going to Sustain SC and then going to the events section. So thank you so much for your valuable time today. It's a real privilege that you were able to take time out of your day to join us for this important important conversation. Together in these conversations and gathering this information, and discussing them, we really do believe that we can bridge commerce and conservation for a sustainable South Carolina. So look forward to further discussions. And if you have any questions, please reach out to any of us on the team. And we will make sure to address any information that you may need. So a big shout out to Emily Skaggs for being our tech webinar today as well, and team tagging the effort. On that note, we'll go ahead and sign out and look forward to talking further. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.